tragedy. A deadly fire breaks out at a 19-story high-rise in the Bronx.
This is going to be one of the worst fires that we have witnessed here in the city of New York.
Smoke pouring out the windows. At least 9 children included in the death toll. Dozens of other people seriously hurt. The scale of the damage adding to the ferocity of the flames. Firefighters pushed to the limit in their battle.
And tomorrow, we begin to rebuild.
Vaccine dispute. President Biden's federal vaccine mandate set to be enforced tomorrow. The Supreme Court will resume hearings over the new restrictions. We're digging into the rules.
I am a grocery guy. I'm not the vaccine police.
The Omicron variant surging into the new year. The jump in cases affecting things inside and out of the classroom. Nationwide, school districts in cities like Chicago, Atlanta, and New York are debating on whether to keep their doors open. News Nation's Michael Schur breaks it all down. Chaos in Kazakhstan. The death toll from last week's violent protests has ballooned from 44 to at least 164, and more than 5,000 people have been detained. Plus, Russian troops are pouring into the country. The urgent message the Biden administration is sending to Kazakhstan's leaders. Online sports betting continues to explode across the country, and New Yorkers can now place bets on their phones, the states that are likely to legalize sports wagers. And we begin with breaking news. Multiple people are dead after a horrific fire engulfed a high-rise apartment in New York City. We know that several children, 9, are among the lives lost. The fire started this morning in the Bronx. Firefighters trying to navigate that smoke that covered the entire height of the 19-story building. Authorities say crews found victims on every floor, and dozens were sent to the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Tonight, Governor Kathy Hochul addressed the destruction. And News Nation correspondent Tom Negevin leads us off tonight from the Bronx. And Tom, are officials expecting this death toll to climb? It is already horrific. Disrupted learning. A growing number of school districts are debating whether they should open their doors for in-person learning. Many of the nation's largest school systems, from New York to Chicago to Atlanta, are crumbling under the weight of the Omicron variant. News Nation correspondent Michael Schur is following this story, and he has more on this escalating problem and a lot of students and parents wondering what their days and weeks will look like. Tomorrow, the Biden administration's federal vaccine mandate for businesses with 100 or more employees goes into effect. That is, if the Supreme Court doesn't have something to say about it. On Friday, the justices took part in a hearing concerning the mandate, during which the court's conservative majority seemed to signal a willingness to block the requirement. Those proceedings are scheduled to continue tomorrow. Joining me now to help us better wrap our heads around this is Brian Dean Abramson. He is an adjunct professor of vaccine law at Florida International University's College of Law. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So the question before the court really is whether to allow the mandates to go into effect while they work their way through the lower courts, not so much on the constitutionality of the mandates themselves. Am I getting that right?
That is absolutely correct.
Okay, so based on the tenor of the questions and the makeup of the court, do you think this mandate has a chance of going into effect as it stands now?
I think it is unlikely. Certainly, I think it's unlikely to go into effect exactly as it stands. I think there are possibilities that either the court will stay the OSHA mandate pending further litigation, or at least put some kind of conditions on it that make it very difficult for OSHA to prosecute companies that aren't conforming to the terms of the mandate.
So I want to take a listen to arguments made by both Justices Elena Kagan and Amy Coney Barrett on either side of the debate. Let's listen, and then we'll get your reaction on the other side.
There's nothing else that will perform that function better than incentivizing people strongly to vaccinate themselves.
That the problem here is its scope, and that there's no differentiation between the risk faced by unvaccinated 22-year-olds and unvaccinated 60-year-olds or industries.
So a lot of different points and arguments made during that hearing, but what do you make of those 2 points?
Well, particularly Justice Barrett brings out an issue that's been brought out in the lower courts, the fact that OSHA tried to do something really sweeping and to capture all companies with over 100 employees without really looking at the circumstances circumstances of particular companies or particular employees. And that's kind of a real infirmity of this regulation as it has been put out. It's clear that it was put out under some pressure from the Biden administration to get something done very quickly and to do something that was very broad and far-reaching. And they may have bitten off a little bit more than they can chew in terms of the way that it was structured.
But they make the argument that this is the very thing OSHA was intended for, right? That all 800,000 people have died in the U.S. And if this isn't a danger to workers, what is?
Well, there's certainly no question that there is a danger. The question is, what is the best approach to address that danger? And there's a degree to which OSHA is the agency that has the authority, that has the experts to make that decision. But there's also a degree to which, there are people on the other side who say, well, it's really not feasible. It's really not workable the way that it is articulated to put this on workplaces like this. And you're not going to end up getting the good effects that you want to get. You're going to be counterproductive in trying to carry this out.
So the argument is really the enforceability of it?
Yes, it's not really enforceable. OSHA doesn't have the resources to enforce it as written. They're going to be requiring employee whistleblowers to say our employer isn't carrying out these things, or looking at actual COVID outbreaks and so forth. And they're going to be having to do that for workplaces where there isn't necessarily a danger, because a lot of people are working from home, or a lot of people are working outdoors all the time, because that's the way OSHA structured the entire mandate.
But OSHA has required certain vaccines in the past, right? There is some, I guess, case law or precedent for that, including people who handle blood work. They had to be vaccinated for hepatitis B. Is that something like that going to be used going forward in this case?
It's possible. The bloodborne pathogen standard, which was discussed by the court at some points, doesn't mandate vaccination. It mandates that vaccines be made available to employees, and that employees acknowledge that if they're not vaccinated, they're at a higher risk. But there's no real consequence beyond that for employees who aren't vaccinated under that standard. This is the first time that the United States federal government has ever attempted to broadly require vaccination as a mandate of the population, or of any segment of the population outside of like the military and federal prisoners and immigrants and so forth.
And schools.
Schools have never really fallen under the federal government, though. The federal government does attach some dollars and say that, your school districts aren't going to get these federal dollars unless you meet these vaccination targets. But it's up to the state governments. And because of that, if you go from state to state, every state has its own individual set of vaccinations that are mandated. Most of them have a certain set in common, but there are some that only a handful of states require and others do not. And that's a decision that's made at that level.
And there is a second part of this case, and that's regarding Medicaid and Medicare workers. And that does seem to have a better chance of success because it involves government-funded programs. Am I right about that, as opposed to private companies?
That is exactly right. It's because, it's not necessarily a private public dichotomy. There are a lot of private hospitals that are recipients of Medicare and Medicaid funds. But ultimately, with the OSHA regulation, we're talking about the government saying we're trying to protect interstate commerce. We have a constitutional authority to do that. We're trying to use that authority to fight a disease. Whereas the CMS regulation, which is for Medicare and Medicaid funding for hospitals, is premised on the idea that we're giving you this money and we can choose to give you this money or not give you this money. It's our money to spend, and we're putting this string on the payment of these funds. And that's something that historically it seems a lot more palatable. It seems more palatable to the justices, to Justice Barrett and perhaps Justice Kavanaugh and some of the others on the court who may be more skeptical of the reach of the OSHA mandate.
So really quickly, before I let you go, what does this mean for all of us who work at companies with more than 100 people starting tomorrow?
Well, the OSHA mandate hasn't been enforced up to this point because of the various stays. And the mandate actually doesn't kick in immediately. There's a supposedly a requirement that people have to start getting vaccinated, but unvaccinated workers would have to be tested on a weekly basis. And that doesn't start until February 9th. So if you have people who aren't vaccinated, there's no consequence of that immediately. The consequence would start in February. And in theory, at that point, if you had unvaccinated workers, you would have to begin testing them weekly. And if they weren't, then you would be susceptible to facing a fine from OSHA.
Professor Abramson, thank you so much. It is confusing. We appreciate you breaking it down for us and your clarity. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
It is indeed confusing.
It is confusing, right?
Yeah.
Hi, Gary.
Yeah, good evening to you.
Good evening.
We are talking severe weather yet again.
And weather-related travel delays have been going on for weeks now. As Gary mentioned, this past week bringing more canceled flights and a snowstorm that left drivers stranded on a Virginia highway for more than 24 hours. Plus, an untold number of airline workers are calling out sick with COVID, another factor contributing to the mass cancellations. Thousands of flights have been cut from the schedule altogether while airlines try to fill their staffing needs. And those cancellations and delays at airports across the U.S. have continued through the weekend. At last check, flight tracking website FlightAware was reporting nearly 3,000 delays nationwide to go along with almost 1,300 cancellations. NewsNation Tampa correspondent Brittany Mueller gives us a travel outlook from one of Florida's busiest airports. And joining me now to talk about all these ongoing travel challenges, specifically as they relate to Omicron sweeping the country and world, is David Slotnick. He is a senior transportation reporter for Business Insider. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Morning. Thanks for having me. Or good evening.
Good evening to you. All right. So the holidays also, they always present challenges when it comes to travel. But this winter has really been the perfect storm. There was already a pilot shortage, supply chain issues, gas price hikes, and then you add in the weather, the COVID infections. How many flight cancellations are we talking about here?
Well, so it's been a mess. We actually just did an analysis of the holiday week specifically, and we saw roughly 20,000 cancellations across the United States. So that includes flights into, out of, and just around the country. It's been a tough situation. And like you mentioned before, this was twofold. It was partly because of the Omicron variant and just pilots, flight attendants calling out sick. But it was also because of these winter storms, which really popped up. It was pretty remarkable over the holiday period, actually. Now, things have improved a little bit, but it's still definitely an ongoing issue on both fronts.
Do you have, short of having a crystal ball, do you have any idea when we could foresee some relief and when we should actually buy a ticket again to go? Because seeing all of the interviews that everyone's been doing on these people stuck at airports looks so miserable.
Sure. So what I think is going to happen is it's really just going to mirror the pandemic and the way that it spreads around the country. If you look at the airlines that were most affected before the storm started, it was United, Delta, and JetBlue. And those are carriers that had hubs in New York and Boston where the virus was really taking off the most. I suspect that as we see it spread across the country, we're just going to see delays, staffing shortages, ebb and flow, really. As it hits Atlanta, we might see problems on Delta. As it hits Houston, we might see issues with United. Dallas, American, and Southwest. So I think it's really just going to track with the rest of the country. The good news is that with the holidays being over, it's a lot easier for the airlines to manage this. So they can be proactive in either drawing down their schedules, or they can combine flights, maybe put things on a larger aircraft. They can, get people reaccommodated in advance. It's a lot easier when they aren't really stressed to the margins with holiday travelers.
So assuming we can even get a ticket, get on a flight, what does this mean for our pocketbooks when it comes to air travel?
So, this is typically the less expensive season, and that's really what we've been seeing so far. It's really not different than any other year. What it does mean is that you might have unexpected expenses if you end up on a flight that gets canceled or if you get stranded. That's something that travel insurance can help with. If you have a credit card that has travel insurance built in and you use that to buy the tickets, that might cover you. But it's really just something to keep mind of, especially when you have carry-on. You might want to make sure that you're not checking any medications or any essentials that you need that night.
All right. Well, that's a little bit of good news. I guess we'll end there. David, thank you so much. We appreciate having you tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Dream home, the most expensive house in the country, is hitting the auction block. The record-setting price for this mega mansion. Here's a look at some international headlines tonight. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has tested positive for COVID-19. The New York representative is experiencing symptoms and recovering at home. This is at least the fourth breakthrough case among congresspeople this weekend. New York City is now the first major American city to grant widespread municipal voting rights to non-citizens. This new legislation was approved by the city council a month ago and took effect today. It allows non-citizens who have been residents of the city for at least 30 days, as well as those authorized to work in the U.S., to help select the city's mayor, council members, and other positions. However, they're not eligible to vote in federal or state elections. Tomorrow, a brand new mansion will hit the market in the Los Angeles area, and it will become the most expensive home in America if it sells for its asking price. This mega mansion in the Bel Air neighborhood, it has an asking price of $295 million. It has 20 bedrooms, 30 bathrooms, 5 pools, a salon, a nightclub, a gym, a bowling alley, a candy room, and sweeping views of Los Angeles and the Pacific Ocean. If it doesn't sell by the end of February, it will head to auction and go to the highest bidder. And we are still keeping track of that breaking news, that apartment fire that killed 19 in New York City. And dozens of people are in hospitals. You can see the smoke climbing up the Bronx high-rise. Our team is still on the ground there, and we'll have more details on this horrific fire. The disappearance of Chance Engelbert is raising eyebrows in Nebraska. The father and husband vanished in July of 2019. More than 2 years later, after continued searches, there is still no sign of Chance, and concerns are growing that something bad may have happened. You're going to see exclusive surveillance video of that last time Chance was seen and hear from nearly everyone involved in this case. Here's investigative correspondent Rich McHugh. Here's a look at some international headlines tonight. Tennis star Novak Djokovic is in an Australian courtroom right now. His lawyers making the case that he should stay in Australia for the Australian Open after the government there rejected his vaccine exemption upon his arrival. Court papers filed by the government say, quote, "There is no such thing as an assurance of entry by a non-citizen into Australia." Attorneys for Djokovic say he was granted the medical exemption because he had COVID-19 last month. Pictures on social media showed him making public appearances days after he says he was tested. It's unclear, though, whether the tennis player knew of his COVID status at the time. More than 150 people are dead after a week of protests in Kazakhstan. The majority occurred in the city of Almaty, where protesters took over government buildings and set some of them on fire. The demonstrations were sparked by fuel prices, but then escalated into violent anti-government riots. Last week, troops from other countries, including Russia, were called in to stabilize the situation. Meanwhile, the country remains in a state of emergency with a nationwide curfew. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke with the countries and reiterated the United States' full support for Kazakhstan's constitutional institutions. Diplomatic talks between the U.S. and Russia are set to begin tomorrow in Geneva regarding worries about a possible invasion of Ukraine. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman will meet with Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister. Russia has nearly 100,000 troops near the Ukrainian border, but says it is not preparing for an invasion and wants the West to withdraw support for the Ukrainian government. The U.S. has not ruled out sanctions, which Russia says would signal a complete breakdown of diplomacy. Sports betting explosion. More people across the country are able to place bets on their favorite events, and in some places, you can place a wager on your phone. We'll tell you where after the break. Legalized sports gambling is expanding across the country. About half of U.S. states have implemented some form of it since 2018, when the Supreme Court struck down a federal law that banned it. That includes New Jersey, which has surpassed Nevada as the top sports betting market in the U.S., and Connecticut, which began accepting sports wagers in October. Now the state of New York has made mobile sports betting legal in an effort to attract gamblers who are lured away to neighboring states. News Nation's Steve Koosh has more from Madison Square Garden. And we have breaking news tonight. We have just learned that comedian Bob Saget is dead. He was reportedly found dead in a Florida hotel room. Officials say detectives found no signs of foul play or drug use. The stand-up comic made a career on stage telling raunchy jokes, but of course was best known for his good guy character on the 90s sitcom Full House. Bob Saget was 65. We'll be right back. And we want to get to that other breaking news tonight. At least 19 people, including 9 children, killed in an apartment fire in New York City in the Bronx borough. City officials say at least 63 people were injured during the 5-alarm fire, 32 of them with life-threatening injuries. New York City Mayor Eric Adams calling it, quote, a tragedy beyond measure. News Nation's Tom Negevin has been on the ground following these new developments. And Tom, such a heartbreaking story. Important information. Tom, thank you so much for that report. And let's bring in now New York Assemblyman Kenny Burgos. His district includes the Bronx. Thank you so much for making the time for us. I know it's been a tragic day for you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's certainly been a whirlwind of a day.
So tell me what you're hearing from your constituents and what you make of the information that Tom just relayed to us, which is that all of the fire departments are short members because of COVID.
Yeah, I've been receiving phone calls since the morning. This is an incredibly tragic scenario happening here in the Bronx. So we've just been making sure these families are taken care of, making sure, people who come out of the building are housed, given the proper resources. And as far as the firefighters, it's a difficult time, right? We're still dealing with this COVID-19 pandemic. We have vaccine mandates. We have a lot going on in our city. But I'm thankful that the fire department was able to respond in 3 minutes. That's huge. That saved many, many lives. So I'm thankful for their heroic actions and for the work they've done today.
And once again, illustrations of the world's finest firefighters risking their lives, going in without oxygen, getting injured themselves to save others.
Yeah, absolutely heroic. You can't ask for a better crew of firefighters than New York City Fire Department. This is an awful tragedy, but to think of the size and the vastness of this building, the way this smoke has just kind of taken over the entire building so quickly, this could have been, unfortunately, even worse. So we do have to thank our firefighters for their actions today.
And what can you tell us about the victims? Obviously, we know that 9 of them were children. That is just heartbreaking. We heard in that press conference that many of them are immigrants. And you think about the irony of that, crossing oceans for a better life, only to meet this fate in their own home.
It's horrible. You hear 9 children dead. It's probably some of the worst news you can ever hear. And you're right. This building was definitely a building with many immigrants. And it's not lost on me that, unfortunately, immigrants and low-income citizens and Black and brown New Yorkers are unfortunately typically the victims of things like this. Now, we know this case seems to be from a space heater, but I'm gonna look forward to see what this investigation looks like because, we know a lot of these buildings go into decay, a lot of, disinvestment, and we don't know there could be more causes of this fire. So we're looking to see what the investigation brings. Do you know if there was heat in the building, if everything was functioning correctly this winter, or why they were using space heaters? It appears to be, the smoke alarms are working. I haven't received reports that heat was not working, but you do hear space heaters being used. So you have to wonder, was it sufficient? That is unfortunately an issue we have sometimes throughout the city and in some of these buildings. So I would hope not. But again, we'll have to see this investigation and see what was the real cause of it. And I know I was listening to the press conference, so I know there were no fire escapes. The people were making their way inside the building, down the stairwells, and the firefighters saying that there were people on every single floor. What can you tell us about the layout of the building and the escape routes in the building and how people were trying to get out? Well, I haven't been in this particular building myself, but if it's, similar to as many, large apartment buildings in the Bronx, these are vast. This is an entire complex sometimes. It is not easy. It is not quick to get out of some of these buildings. You're talking about multi-story, multi-leveled. You've got to get through. There's probably 2 or 3 different stairwells. And then you mix that in the fact of you're panicking. There's smoke everywhere. It is a difficult task to get out of there. So I can only imagine, what these families were going through, and my heart is with them, with the victims and all the families who were fortunate to make it out. It is just unspeakable. We know that more than 60 people are at hospitals with life-threatening injuries. Do you expect this death toll to climb? I think so. I think we're still very early in this. This only happened just this morning on a Sunday morning. And we're hearing reports. Things will always change. I think we'll have a lot more information by the morning. There are a lot of families in there. So I think we'll have to wait for a few more days to have the real number, but I do expect, unfortunately, the number to climb. Do you know anything about the number of people who were in each unit? We just covered that other horrible fire in Philadelphia, and there were, way more people than expected living in each unit. Do we know if that's the case in this fire? We don't know for certain, but we know New York City, the Bronx included, is an expensive city. And, it is not uncommon to have many individuals, sometimes multiple families, living in one apartment. In this specific apartment, I believe the report said it was a duplex. So this seems to be a sizable, maybe even pre-war apartment. So I would not be shocked to hear that we would have multiple individuals and multiple families within a lot of these units.
What kind of questions will you be asking in your capacity as a public official?
Yeah, so my questions are absolutely going to be, first and foremost, the smoke detectors. Were they all operable? Make sure they're up to code. Again, right, talking about regulations, whether it's family size, making sure whether we don't have any fire escapes here, right? So are there fire doors? What are the fire exits looking like? What made this fire become such a tragedy as opposed to maybe just being something that's limited to a kitchen fire? We need to know what caused it and what we can do going forward to prevent this from ever happening again in our city.
And what about the problem of space heater fires? Because this is something in the news we see every single winter. Usually it's not to this extreme extent, but what do you think about space heaters and their relation to starting fires, especially in a high density building like this?
They unfortunately appear to be the cause of one and way too many fires going on, not only in this city, but throughout this country. I mean, I know I've spoken with firefighters in our borough, and we've had, educational kind of like courses going on and telling families, be aware of your space heaters and other things you should be aware of to not have fires. But space heaters really seem to have a big issue in causing these fires. So I think we need to look at this from a consumer standpoint, whether the state or the federal government, but maybe we have to take a look at the production of these things and have a lot more safety regulation, because between space heaters and the lithium ion batteries, these seem to be causing a lot of fires, especially here in New York City.
And I've been speaking to you and asking you questions in your capacity as an elected official, but these are your constituents, these are your fellow New Yorkers. What has been your reaction just hearing the news and hearing how bad this actually is? This truly has to be one of the saddest days in my time as a lawmaker. This is a borough that has birthed me, has raised me. My family still lives here. So, I feel an immense kind of connection to this happening. I myself had a house fire. Nothing to this level, but so to know what these families might be going through and the ones that lost their lives to this tragedy, it happens in an instant. And when you hear, especially again, 9 children losing their lives, I can't think of a Saturday here in New York. What are your next steps as a lawmaker?
So our next steps are going to be going up to the state. We're in session right now up in Albany. And obviously this is going to be a big, big issue. So we're going to go to our committees and speak to the fire department, speak to the NYPD, speak with the building, with management, anyone and everyone that is involved in this. And again, do our best, whether it's investigations, whether it's passing new policy, new laws, regulations, to make sure we do not have this happen again in our city.
And I understand fellow New Yorkers are already stepping up. They're gathering belongings. They're doing everything they can, just hours later to help these people who they don't even know. That really speaks to the spirit of New York.
That is the beauty of this city, the beauty of this state. You got 9 million people from every single country, walk of life, different languages, but we come together in times of crisis and we help out our neighbors. And that is really the most beautiful thing about this city that I love.
Well, Mr. Burgos, we will leave it there. We appreciate your time. We know you're very busy, and our thoughts are with you and everyone in New York and those victims especially. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Turning now to the pandemic, and lawmakers in cities across the country are sending students back to school despite the recent spike in COVID cases nationwide. News Nation's Michael Schur has a closer look at both sides of the issue. And we want to get back to that breaking news on the death of comedian Bob Saget in Orlando, Florida. We have entertainment reporter Josh McBride on the phone with us. So Josh, are you there?
I am, yeah.
Thank you so much for making the time for us. And this comes as a shock to so many tonight. What is your reaction?
Look, a big loss for the entertainment community. If you were a child or a teenager in the 90s, you will remember Bob Saget, of course, as his famous role as Danny Tanner on Full House. This is a big loss, especially for the comedy community. We don't know much. We do know that the Orange County Sheriff Office did put out a tweet less than an hour ago. People were skeptical about what he had passed from. We're not sure yet. They do say, quote, the man was identified as Robert Saget and pronounced deceased on scene. Detectives found no signs of foul play or drug use in this case. If you don't know him from Full House, you know him from America's Funniest Home Videos or How I Met Your Mother. This is a big loss.
Yeah, and talk about his mark on Hollywood, because he was so dynamic, right? He was raunchy, he did adult comedy, he was inappropriate at times, but so funny, and yet he was America's favorite dad.
Absolutely. And we grew up with him as America's favorite dad. I talked to a couple of sources that are close to him and his family, and they're absolutely devastated. We grew up with him making jokes, and also making jokes off of Fuller House, that pushed the barriers of comedy. This is a big loss for I feel like comedians, because he was an icon, especially in this space. People who may be new to Bob Saget, and they shouldn't be, they might have seen him on The Masked Singer in 2020. He actually had dates lined up through June for this tour that he's on right now, the I Don't Do Negative tour. So this is really, it comes as a shock, really.
And what were his latter days like? I mean, we kind of remember him from the 90s, as you said. Everyone who grew up in the 90s that knows him as his Full House character, and we knew that he was a comedian later. But what was his life like, over the past decade or so?
Yeah, well, he did join the cast of Fuller House when Full House did do the revamp. I think that's important to mention, because that was such a big success on Netflix. He did a lot of documentaries where he popped in sort of to one-off episodes here and there. I mentioned How I Met Your Mother. He did that. In 2014, he was actually nominated for a Grammy Award for Best Comedy Album. I mean, this guy kind of had TV and comedy on lock. This is what he did, and I feel like he was one of those actors who really could walk on any comedic television show and get a cameo role if he wanted. This was the person who pushed the boundaries and the limits of comedy. You might remember him. He was also in Madagascar in 2005 as a zoo animal. He's just had so much work. A lot of people even remember him as like cameos from like the movie Half Baked back in 1998. So I say this again, but what a sad, really big loss for comedians, especially because this was what he grasped on. And this is what he was known as.
Yeah, I will never forget that Half-Baked cameo. That's probably one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And that's what I always remember when I think of him, is just how extreme and how polar opposite the parts he could play were.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you said it before. I think he pushed the boundaries of comedy. I think he took it, some would call it, I think he had people calling him disgusting or grotesque, but he really pushed the boundaries of making people laugh. He was a comedian that really did whatever it took to get the laugh.
And I was reading about him. He intended to be a doctor, and an English teacher in high school saw the creative potential in him. They saw his artistic ability, that teacher, and encouraged him to pursue a career in the arts. And something like that can just completely change a person's life and send it on that upward trajectory. And I know he has inspired so many people after him.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a good point to mention. I think between getting involved in the arts, he found his niche when he jumped into TV and film. I think it was 1977. So, this was his life and his livelihood. We haven't, this is actually important to mention, we haven't heard from any of the cast of Full House or Fuller House yet. I'm assuming there will be tributes in the next day or two. This was a family onset and offset, I'm told. In that these people grew up together and worked together for hours upon hours.
We want to get back now to that breaking news on the death of comedian and actor Bob Saget. We have entertainment reporter Sam Rubin on the phone with us. Sam, thank you so much for talking with us. We're sorry about that technical delay earlier. What is your reaction, and what is the reaction of Hollywood tonight?
I think people are absolutely in shock. Bob Saget had been with us forever. I think we anticipated he would be with us forever, just 65 years of age, which really nowadays is young. Bob Saget was vibrant and active and very much beloved. Also working for a long time, happily so, as a touring comic. So he was out on the road, performance just last night, 2 hours in length in Jacksonville, Florida, then traveling to Orlando, Florida. I'm sure he had more Florida dates, and I know he had a huge number of dates lined up for 2022. It's just startling and shocking and sad. A menschy guy, a great guy, really well thought of in Hollywood, really respected, really funny. And there's this duality, that the TV dad and then the very, very risque comic. His show was not for kids at all. But of course, he endeared himself to families with both Full House and Fuller House.
And his range, as you mentioned, this duality, he was so good at both of these things, right? He won over people who enjoyed dark comedy and raunchy comedy, and then he also won over families who could watch Full House together.
Yeah, it was the most remarkable thing because I think usually one would sort of permeate the other, but he was this, lovable TV dad that, I'm sure a lot of people hearing this news are particularly sad because they feel to a degree raised by these parental figures. And I'm thinking of and feeling for the young women who, starred as his daughters who just absolutely loved him, really loved him. And then, if you were to see him in a comedy club, it was a different person entirely. And I think he enjoyed the fact that, people were kind of open-mouthed and shocked about it. He didn't want to embarrass anybody by any means, and he wouldn't feel comfortable doing that stuff in front of the same kind of audiences that watch the TV show. But, he played in comedy clubs where they checked your ID and made sure you were of an appropriate age. And if you were of an appropriate age, there's a phrase comics, he was the bluest of the blue, but not in a bad way. He was funny.
He was funny, and he was also dark, and he had this satire, right? This ability to look at society and make fun of things that could be sad or dark or, scary.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, there were these sort of contrasts. He would sometimes pick up a guitar and start what you think was kind of a happy, upbeat song, but then the lyrics would have a particularly naughty twist. And he went through some sad times. His sister, I'm terrified I'm going to mispronounce it. I want to say it's called scleroderma, but it's a really horrific ailment that starts with the skin. He was a tireless advocate and fundraiser for that particular condition. And he did an annual event here in Los Angeles where he was able to call on all his friends, and they all showed up. He also made a television movie about that subject. So he was not just all frivolity. There was a lot to him, a lot of depth to him, really good podcast that people enjoyed and admired very much called Bob Saget is Here for You. And that's how I think people felt, that he really is, there for him. And so now to confront this news that he's gone, it's really just a shock. It's stunning and sad and hard to believe.
It is stunning. And you are someone who has interviewed every celebrity under the sun. You've been in Hollywood for a long time. You've been a reporter there. What kind of mark did he make on Hollywood?
I think the fact that he was able to so successfully keep going. At one time, between America's Funniest Home Videos and Full House, Bob Saget was probably on TV as much or more than any other personality. And usually when you have you burn that brightly, sometimes you just fade away entirely. He never did. Always pursuing stand-up, always pursuing a variety of, guest roles and different things. How I Met Your Mother, of course, a more recent sitcom that he was intimately involved with. The Bob Saget was always around, and it's just really hard to grasp that he won't be around anymore. But obviously the memory carries on, and the fondness people have for him carry on.
Yeah, it wasn't only his range and his duality and his versatility, but it was also his staying power, that he managed to stay relevant and through every age group and kind of every category of person, whether you liked shocking humor or whether you liked something that was more comfortable and family-oriented.
Right, and there's not a lot of people who can do that. And the fact is that he was sort of, in the movie business, they talk about the 4 quadrants of audience, which reference gender and age, and the fact that he was sort of one of those rare 4-quadrant appeals speaks of his talent and just in a personal way, just this menschy quality. He's going to be terribly missed. He's a good guy, a nice guy, a talented guy.
One of his parents was a supermarket executive. The other was a hospital administrator. He came from a Jewish family. What was his life like before he broke into the big screen?
You know what? I knew him really once it started to build here. So I don't know. He was a recipient of a Student Academy Award in the early 70s, so he obviously demonstrated some talent early on. And then between America's Funniest Videos and Full House, nobody's an overnight success, but he got very big very, very quickly. He's the father of 3 daughters, all who are in their 20s or a little older. He had one long-term marriage and then was recently married again. I know he was very happy in that marriage. I don't really know him before he became the Bob Saget we all know, but obviously a lot of us are thinking of that Bob Saget now.
Well, whatever it was, it shaped him to be beloved by the entire country and much of the world. And I know that you joined us right away for this breaking news, but have you gotten any kind of gauge on what other celebrities are saying and the reaction tonight as people learn this shocking news?
Not quite yet. I think this will happen throughout the course of the evening and certainly overnight. I think a lot of people, frankly, aren't aware of it, and they're becoming aware of it, and I think it's going to take some time to sink in. I think the initial reaction, which was my reaction, was, well, that can't be right. But obviously and sadly it is.
Yeah, it took a while to kind of double check and confirm because no one really could believe it. And you mentioned his charity work. You mentioned his sister's illness and how that shaped him. So he had a kindness, too, that we didn't all see.
Yeah. I mean, he was very much an advocate for his sister. He was a remarkably kind guy.
All right. Well, Sam Rubin, we will let you go. We know that you're very, very busy, and we really appreciate your time tonight. Thank you for giving us a little insight into Bob Saget.
You bet. Thank you.
And we will be right back. And back to that breaking news, officials in Orange County, Florida, confirming that America's dad, Bob Saget, has died at the age of 65. Police were called to his hotel room at the Ritz-Carlton in Orlando, where he was pronounced dead. On the scene, investigators say there were no signs of foul play in this case. Bob Saget was a comedian who played, of course, that iconic role of Danny Tanner on the long-running sitcom Full House. That's where a lot of us know him from. He was also a longtime host of America's Funniest Home Videos. Many celebrities are reacting as this news gets out tonight. Jim Gaffigan tweeted, "Oh my God, R.I.P. What a warm and kind man we lost. The world has lost one of the nicest." We have Variety Deputy TV Editor Michael Schneider on the phone with us. And Michael, this is a shock to us all.
Truly. Bob Saget was only 65. He was in the middle of a tour. He seemed just still so vibrant, so youthful. We're all just sort of stunned at the news.
Yeah, and he was a very dynamic person. You know, he graduated from Temple University in 1978. He made his way into comedy clubs. He actually won a Student Academy Award studying film in college after a high school teacher recognized his artistic ability and encouraged him not to pursue an MD, but rather to go into the arts and pursue acting. And we've been talking all night about his range, you know, the Full House, America's Dad that everyone loved, the cozy TV dad versus the raunchy comic who was, entertaining adults and making people laugh until the very end.
Yeah, that was what was so great about Bob Saget. At one point, you couldn't escape him on television. He was everywhere. He was on Full House. He was hosting America's Funniest Home Videos. He was still doing his stand-up, which, like you mentioned, was a little more blue than the family-oriented Danny Tanner on Full House. But nonetheless, he was beloved by comedians, beloved by children who grew up watching Full House. Generations sort of grew up with Bob Saget as their TV dad, and I think they're all sort of reeling today because of this news.
And there aren't that many people in Hollywood with that type of staying power, that type of relevancy, and that type of range.
No, and a lot of it just comes down to, I mean, he was such a consummate performer. He was so quick. Whenever he was on anything, he immediately had the quick wit. He was very just personable, just a good guy in person, a philanthropist as well. Just one of these people who was appreciated by so many different generations. And I think that helped his longevity, is that so many different generations loved Bob Saget.
Absolutely. And we know that there was no foul play involved. That's according to the police in Florida, that there was no drugs involved. But it's so shocking, especially because he was performing last night near Jacksonville at a comedy club. He just tweeted about 16 hours ago expressing his gratitude to his fans.
Yeah, and that's what's so sad and so sudden is obviously we'll find out in the coming days what happened. These things do happen sometimes as you get older, as I'm learning myself. And, I do feel for his family. I do feel for his fans and just, his comedian family as well. They're all coming out tonight on Twitter and just expressing shock and sadness because he was so beloved by the comedian community, particularly as sort of a comedian's comedian.
Absolutely. What are you hearing in terms of reaction from other comedians and other celebrities in Hollywood as a whole?
I think first everyone is stunned. They're shocked, but also just he was beloved by every comedian imaginable. Again, just as a good guy, as a really nice person, a good person, but also just a quick wit, a sharp razor, a comedic ability that not everyone has, and also the fact that he could play blue, but also play to families. He was so versatile and so beloved by all comedians. I didn't know a comedian who didn't love Bob Saget.
And maybe there was a little part of him in every role. I mean, people talk about how kind he was and how caring and how loving he was. And maybe that's where, he drew his inspiration for his character in Full House. And then maybe there was another side of him, which is where he drew his inspiration for his comedy and why so many people could relate to him in that way.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, he supported research in scleroderma, which is a rare skin disease that his sister passed away from, and he would hold tributes and concerts and fundraisers every year for it, and anyone would show up and support Bob because they knew how much this meant to him and how much obviously that meant for Bob meant to them.
And he was also a master of satire. Talk about him in that realm.
Yeah, he was always great when it came to roasts as well. He would always have a quick, pithy quip when it came to sort of having some fun with folks, and he played with his image too, especially in the post Full House years. He could be really satirical when it came to poking a little fun at being America's dad, because we know he did have a dark and dirty side as well, and that was sort of fun to poke a little bit of a few holes in that Danny Tanner character.
And we've been talking about that line, which I cannot deliver on television, in the movie Half Baked, and that line just stays with people. People recite that still to this day. It was just a one-liner where he made a cameo, but it was so cutting and so funny and so shocking after knowing him as America's dad.
Right. And that's, again, you mentioned staying power, and I think that's part of it, is that people really appreciated the fact that they loved him as America's TV dad, but they also loved him as a blue, dark comedian, and the fact that he had that he was in on the joke. People really appreciated it, and they loved him for it.
And so dynamic, an interesting background. Take us inside, what you know of his mind and his intellect and his ability to have that range.
Well, he had this sharp comedic mind that, he could come on, countless, he was on talk shows and radio shows and immediately come in and just riff and sometimes derail the entire show. But that was part of the comedy, was the fact that he was just going to come in and just take over and riff on whatever he saw or was looking at, and sometimes the host wouldn't really know what to expect. If you couldn't keep up with Bob, then you were in trouble because he was going to take over, and that's the sign of a really sharp comedic mind, is he could just come in and just dominate and have some fun with you.
And let's talk about America's Home Videos, because we're saturated with videos from cell phones in this day and age, but that was pretty groundbreaking at the time.
Yeah, and he was the first host, and what was also groundbreaking, obviously, because back then there was no social media. People had to mail in VHS tapes, and it was a very different kind of show on TV. But also groundbreaking in the fact that Bob Saget was on 2 top 10 primetime series at the same time, with both Full House and America's Funniest Home Videos, both on ABC at the same moment, both dominating in the ratings. That's a rare feat. Not many people have had 2 hit TV shows on the air at the exact same time, and that's just a testament to Bob Saget and how popular he was in the late 80s or in the early 90s.
Absolutely, and the whole time continuing his comedy and being on stage and having that intimate connection with a live audience.
And that's why this really hits hard, is we all grew up with Bob Saget. We all saw him everywhere. He was just such a part of our lives, part of our pop culture lives, and in recent years played himself so often and poked so much fun at himself that we felt like we knew him, even if we didn't know him. And That's why it feels really, really personal today, I think, for everyone just learning this news.
And there's something really endearing about a celebrity who can be self-deprecating. I think everyone appreciates that, you know?
Yeah, and that's what's been fun about Bob Saget is that he didn't take himself too seriously. He had a lot of fun with it. He could really poke fun of himself on TV shows, like Curb Your Enthusiasm, and just really not take it too seriously and allow people to have some fun and have a laugh at his expense. And you also really just appreciated his relationship with some of his co-stars, including on Full House, and you could tell like they really did love each other, and that really did mean something. John Stamos, Dave Coulier, and then of course his kids, who in personal life he stayed in close contact with as well. It really, really was something that was special that we got to see on TV.
There is something that shows through on camera that you can't fake. And I just want to read a tweet from host Andy Cohen. He said he had the biggest heart and wore it on his sleeve. He was so generous with his feelings, a mensch. And I've heard that word several times, a mensch, in describing Bob Saget tonight. And generous with his feelings is a really nice way to put it.
Yeah, I think a mensch is a perfect way to put it, and just overall, just really, comedians again really appreciated Bob because he spent time talking to them and working with them, and was generous of his time too with other folks, including comedians who were younger than him, who were just on their way, and I think. Everyone really, if you're a comedian these days, you want to be Bob Saget. You look at that, and that was a life well lived.
Well, Michael Schneider, we've taken a lot of your time tonight. We really appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you're just tuning in, comedian Bob Saget has died. Caitlin Becker is a senior reporter from DailyMail.com. She is joining us now with more. So, Caitlin, what are you hearing? What is the reaction tonight in Hollywood?
Shock more than anything else. It's really shock. I mean, I heard you guys speaking in the segment prior to this about how he's on a tour. And just last night, I mean, he shared a selfie from the stage in Jacksonville just I think it was something like 17, 18 hours ago. So then to find out this news today, I think it's really shocking for both Hollywood and people in his inner circle, and the sheriffs have confirmed that he did pass away and also noted in a tweet that there was no foul play suspected and that they didn't see any evidence of drug use at the scene. So there are a lot of questions as to just what happened. I mean, he's only 65 years old.
And I think America at large, feeling the same way.
Very, very much so. You look back at Bob Saget's career, and certainly for people in my generation, he's sort of that proverbial TV dad. You just think that a presence like that is going to be around forever and ever and ever, especially since he reprised that role of Danny Tanner on Fuller House only recently for a whole new generation of people. So it's a really great loss.
And, with celebrities, especially when they're around for this long, especially in Hollywood, you almost always hear about some sort of scandal or that they've treated someone badly or that they've done something that's worth writing about. But with him, it seems that all of the reports and all of the memories and everyone who talks about him just talks about how kind he was, how nice he was.
It's overwhelming, I think, when you do find a celebrity like that. When we talked a lot about this just recently with the passing of Betty White, when you find these types of celebrities like Betty, like Bob, who are beloved within their own community. And I had the privilege of interviewing Bob when his book came out back in 2014. And it was the wildest, most hysterical, unhinged live interview I think I'd ever done in my entire life. He was there for the laugh, and he wanted everyone in the room to just be happy. And I think what's also interesting is that the Danny Tanner, America's Funniest Home Video version of Bob that a lot of people are familiar with was very antithetical to his comedy routines on stage, which could be very dirty, very racy, very inappropriate. And I think he just kind of put that side about him out there for the laugh. And so nobody was expected. You know, if he said anything kind of wild or off the cuff, that was just sort of his brand of comedy. And when it came to his co-stars and the people that he worked with, he was fiercely protective over those girls on Full House. He loved his co-stars, and it just seemed that reputation followed him with every single job that he had.
And they grew up with him. He helped raise them in a way, not only on television, but in real life as someone who was supportive of them. And of course, he had immense love for his biological daughters, for the daughters he actually did raise.
Yeah, and that's, you know, your heart really breaks for those 3 girls that he's leaving behind, of course, his wife and all of his loved ones. But there's, you know, we all, I think, as fans feel like we lost a bit of our dad here, but to lose their own father, I'm sure, is just heartbreaking. And it just seemed so unexpected, certainly from our perspective. I don't know if there was perhaps something going on sort of medically or something, but nothing like that has been revealed. So from a fan's perspective, we're certainly caught off guard, but 65 is too young.
It is too young. Talk about his family dynamics, because we knew him on the screen or maybe in a comedy club or from America's Funniest Home Videos or making cameos in movies, but he had a whole life that we didn't see every day, and that was his love of his daughters, his love of his wife, his love for his sister, and his unending mission to raise money for the disease that she suffered from.
Mm-hmm. You know, Bob's life seemed to have been surrounded by lots and lots of women. I mean, very much his personal life mirrored those 3 girls on Full House. He's got 3 daughters. He was married. He had an ex-wife, and it just seemed like he was constantly surrounded by strong, powerful, wonderful women. And he just seemed to revere in that. You know, if you go back and read passages from his books, they are a little shocking about sort of how he treated fatherhood when he first got introduced to it. But it just seemed like at his very, very core, he was a devoted and loving father and just wanted to work hard to raise, you know, good, great kids that became good, great adults.
Well, tell me about that, because I haven't read his books.
Oh, you'd have to prepare yourself. It's pretty raunchy. I interviewed him about the book back in 2014. And, you know, my experience with Bob Saget was as Danny Tanner, and was on America's Funniest Home Videos, which you just don't get more wholesome than that. But his book very much mirrored his comedy routines, which were much darker, much funnier, much more adult. And he kind of bridged this gap between comedy and funny and real life, and the tough parts about introducing your baby to new friends and some of the off-the-cuff things that we certainly don't want to repeat here on primetime. But I think he would appreciate the fact that people go back and remember this side of him.
And he was able to win the hearts of those family-oriented viewers at the same time, without alienating them, at the same time that he was doing this raunchy, dark satire.
That is a real testament to his talent, I think, where he was so genuinely and unapologetically him. So he did have that, you know, very fatherly feeling to him, and kind and appreciating to all of those people around him, that did translate into his role on Full House and in America's Funniest Home Video, where, you know, just families across the country just welcomed him into your home. But he was not a one-dimensional kind of person. You know, he had this other side of him, and he just genuinely put that both sides, light and dark, and people embraced him. And I heard you speaking about this before when you had your previous guest on, that he was kind, unfailingly kind and warm and welcoming, and then would hit you with a little zinger, and you just felt immediately comfortable in his presence.
All right, Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us. That does it for us tonight. Thank you for joining us. Good night.